I've always loved Subnautica's story. I know it's gotten some flack for not being as direct as some people would like, but from a lore perspective, I still think it's incredibly well designed. Between all the data terminals you can scan, the design and location of the game's major structures, and the geography of the world itself, it really feels like all the stuff you learn about actually happened, and I've always had a ton of fun trying to piece together every last detail. Then there's Below Zero. Its story is also not without criticism, ironically for being a little too involved in hand-holdy. But as a story, I still think the actual structure is pretty solid. Events and plot points fit within the pre-existing lore, and there are a number of callbacks to the first game, making it feel like everything still has a pretty good explanation. But there's one exception. A character who is very important to Below Zero's story and whose entire existence at this point is a complete mystery. If you've played this game before, then you probably already know who I'm talking about. That person is the one and only Marguerit Maida. Throughout both games, Marguerite is the only human besides the player that we get to interact with, and despite involving perhaps the series' biggest plot hole, we actually know quite a bit about her. I've already done a full video on Marguerite's life, so I won't get into all the nitty-gritty details, but to give a brief summary, Marguerite was one of the 3 survivors of the Degassi, a ship that crashed roughly 10 years prior to the events of Subnautica. She, along with the other 2 survivors, Paul and Bart Torgal, built a couple small bases on the floating island, before later moving to the Jellyshroom Caves and finally the Deep Grand Reef. It was here that they learned they were infected with the Kara bacterium, and after several unsuccessful attempts at finding a cure, the base was attacked by a Reaper Leviathan, leading to what we thought were the eventual deaths of Marguerite, Bart, and Paul. But upon playing Below Zero, we learn that Marguerite actually survived. She has a base in the Deep Lily Pads cave, a greenhouse up on an iceberg, and plays a decently sized role in that game's story. Now, the confusing part about all this isn't how she survived the Reaper attack, or how she managed to get halfway across the planet to Sector Zero. For those, we've actually been given an explanation. Instead, the thing that the community's found most puzzling is how on Earth Marguerite managed to survive 12 years until the events of Below Zero. I mean, back in the Grand Reef, she was already starting to show visible symptoms of the Kara bacterium. And to put that into perspective, when the player finds themselves under similar circumstances in the first game, the PDA estimates that you only have around 2 weeks left to live, meaning Marguerite somehow managed to survive 312 times longer than expected. Now, I suppose this is a bit of an exaggeration. After all, the player does end up curing the bacterium in Subnautica, meaning as long as Marguerite made it to this point, she'd essentially be home free. But this is still a full 10 years after the Degassi incident. So what's the game's explanation for how she managed to survive a full decade? Well, there isn't one. After her conversations with Paul and Bart in the Deep Grand Reef, Marguerite never mentions the Kara bacterium again, save for a brief conversation in Below Zero where she reiterates just how dangerous it is. So it's easy to see how most of the community has just written this off as a plot hole, a massive blemish in a series that has otherwise been pretty good at covering its bases. But I really don't like plot holes. And hey, while the game may have not given us a clear-cut explanation, it's not like we don't have anything to go off of. So today, I'm gonna do my best to try and piece together how Marguerite might have been able to survive. In order to answer this question, I think it's useful to look at how all the other creatures on the planet were surviving. After all, the Kara was released here over 1,000 years ago, so if we can figure out how everything else managed to stay alive, it should hopefully shine some light on how Marguerite was able to do it. Starting off with Subnautica, everything here can be traced back to the Sea Emperor in the primary containment facility. As you probably know, Sea Emperors produce this golden substance known as Enzyme 42, one of the very few things that's actually effective against the Kara. To get this life-saving enzyme up to the surface, the Sea Emperor trained peepers to travel up a network of pipes, where the enzyme could then be spread up the food chain or tangentially to other creatures. Now, since the Sea Emperor was so old, the enzyme it produced was highly unstable, making it unviable as a full-on vaccine. But when consumed regularly and in high enough quantities, it could still slow, inhibit, or even push back the Kara altogether. This meant that if one was able to consume enough of the enzyme, they could theoretically stall the craw indefinitely. And this is what kept the entire crater alive for 1,000 years. As for the world of Below Zero, how everything managed to survive there is a bit more uncertain. It's possible that it's the very same enzyme 42 as with the crater, but I personally think this is very unlikely. The Sea Emperor's enzyme was only barely able to keep Subnautica's ecosystem afloat, and I just don't see how enough of it could have spread to the complete other side of the planet that a whole other ecosystem would have been able to survive. And we know from the frozen Leviathan and one of the Mercury 2 voice logs that the craw did make its way over here, so simply avoiding the infection altogether wasn't an option. However, there is another possibility. In Below Zero, we're able to make an item called the Craw Antidote by combining a frost vase with a fevered pepper, and this can be used to cure the aforementioned frozen Leviathan. This means that there's something in the fevered peppers that, when combined with a frost vase, can neutralize the bacterium. And given just how widespread both of these plants are, this is most likely how the creatures in Below Zero were able to survive. So now that we know how everything else managed to live, allow me to propose my theory on how Marguerite did it. After the Degassi crash, we know that Paul, Bart, and Marguerite drifted in a life pod for the first few days. This would have initially kept them safe from the craw, but upon leaving the life pod after washing up on the floating island, the trio were likely infected almost immediately. For the next few weeks, they built habitats, farmed, and did their best to survive, all without much going awry. Well, it seems a bit surprising that no one would be showing any symptoms at this point, especially when we know of someone like Medical Officer Danby, who, in Life Pod 12, developed skin irritation mere hours after the Aurora crash, but it starts to make sense when you look at how the craw actually works. The bacterium eventually alters enough of your genetic code to disable bodily functions, but before that it starts by slowly shutting down your immune system. Meaning a lot of the time, the craw isn't actually the thing that kills you, but rather some other virus or bacteria that you get infected with along the way. Thus, it makes sense why Danby, who was bleeding and likely got infected with a whole host of other stuff, would see his condition degrade faster than Paul, Bart, and Marguerite, who all appear to have been uninjured and fully healthy following the crash. Still, simply being healthy when your immune system is starting to give out will only get you so far, and in a weakened state, the trio were likely not far from experiencing symptoms of their own. But before that could happen, everything would change for the group. Heavy rains caused a landslide that took out the group's main base, forcing them to relocate to the Jelly Shroom Caves. Crucially, the group weren't able to get enough food from their indoor grow beds, meaning for the first time they were forced to eat fish, unknowingly exposing themselves to small amounts of enzyme 42, which slowed down the craw. This bought Marguerite and the others more time, but since they were only eating the fish as a last resort, it's likely they still weren't getting nearly enough of the enzyme, and after relocating a second time to the Deep Grand Reef, their symptoms began to show. The group held on a while longer, attempting to learn about and treat the bacterium, but of course, this endeavor was cut short when Marguerite towed a mortally wounded Reaper back to the base, only for the trio to discover all too late that she had been trailed by a second Reaper, which destroyed their habitat. Marguerite and the Reaper were then pulled into the void as she worked to butcher the thing to death or die trying. Fortunately for Marguerite, she won the battle, and after a few hours, she climbed aboard the Reaper's corpse and slowly drifted towards Sector 0 over the course of about 3 weeks. But during those 3 weeks, something inexplicable happens. Marguerite begins to get better. She was recovering from the craw. On the surface, this makes no sense. Marguerite's infection had already progressed significantly, and this was at a time when her physical and nutritional health were at their worst. Furthermore, when she eventually arrived at Sector 0, she describes herself as having swum lazily to shore, even making a mental note to go back for the Reaper's skull. Those don't sound like the actions of someone who's on the brink of death from an incurable disease. So what happened in those 3 weeks? Well, it turns out the answer may have been sitting on Marguerite's wall this whole time. Basically every creature in Subnautica carries the craw bacterium, and roughly 1 of every 20 are visually infected. However, there are 6 species that differ from the rest. The Sea Emperor, Sea Treader, Reefback, Reaper, Ghost, and Sea Dragon will never show signs of being infected. And this isn't just a scenario where these creatures happen to not be infected now, but could get infected in the future. No, you physically can't infect them, even with console commands. For the Sea Emperors, this makes sense, since they're the ones that actually produce the enzyme 42. But for the other 5 creatures, the only way for this to work would be if they had somehow absorbed a much higher concentration of enzyme 42 than the other species. And while that might seem a bit far-fetched, scientifically speaking, it's actually a bit more plausible than you might think. To explain, let me introduce you to biomagnification and bioaccumulation. Biomagnification is when a chemical compound increases in concentration as you move up the food chain. In real life, this is usually seen as a problem, as dangerous chemicals from things like pollutants and microplastics can accumulate in larger predators, which often include humans. But in Subnautica, this process could apply to enzyme 42, meaning creatures higher up the food chain have higher concentrations of the enzyme, and thus less risk of being infected. And aside from the Reapers, who are occasionally preyed upon by a dwindling number of sea dragons, all of these creatures are at the very top of their respective food chains. Meanwhile, bioaccumulation states that over time, the amount of absorbed chemicals within an organism will also increase. This likely plays less of a role than biomagnification, since this version of the enzyme seems to lose effectiveness over time, but given that big creatures like leviathans aren't likely to get eaten, allowing them to generally live longer than their smaller counterparts, it still probably plays a role. Going back to Marguerite, in order to stay alive, she used a repair tool to light a fire and ate whatever meat she could carve from the Reaper's ribcage. In doing so, she ingested a lot of enzyme 42, enough to halt the bacterium and eventually start repressing the symptoms. Marguerite eventually noticed this, and given the fact that there wasn't much else that could have done it, she puts 2 and 2 together that something in the Reaper had allowed her to recover. If this was indeed Marguerite's mindset, then the actions she takes upon landing in Sector 0 start to make a lot more sense. The very first time we see Marguerite, she's in her prawn suit. It's been upgraded with a chelicerate mandible and has clearly taken quite a beating in the last decade, suggesting she's killed multiple chelicerates. This is interesting because in one of her voice logs, Marguerite mentions that she doesn't just like killing things for the sake of it, and only does so when she needs something. But what would Marguerite have to gain from killing chelicerates? Well, when she arrived in Sector 0, the Reaper that she'd been consuming finally sank, meaning she needed to find a new source of food. Now, even though the enzyme in the Reaper had allowed her to recover, Marguerite still wasn't immune to the Kara, and before long, her symptoms were going to return. To prevent this, Marguerite started killing and eating chelicerates, since they were probably the closest thing to the Reaper that she could find. And since the same processes of biomagnification and bioaccumulation likely also applied to the fevered pepper cure, Marguerite's plan actually worked. As for her base and greenhouse, I'd always wondered why Marguerite decided to build in a remote cave out of all the places she had to choose from. But if she was planning to hunt leviathans, then this spot actually makes a lot of sense. Back in the Deep Grand Reef, Marguerite saw firsthand just what could happen to a sea base when the Reaper followed her home. So by putting her base in a tight cave, it would make it near impossible for a chelicerate to do something similar. But while safe, living in the cave wasn't without its problems. Without any natural sunlight, growing plants was likely difficult, especially for someone like Marguerite, who admits she wasn't the best gardener at the time. And while the chelicerates would allow Marguerite to stave off the Kara, if she went too long eating nothing but meat, it was going to cause its own host of health problems. So she headed up to a nearby iceberg and constructed a greenhouse, where she learned to grow Chinese potatoes, horseshoe shrubs, marble melons, and Preston plants, along with having easy access to frost vases and fevered peppers, which grow naturally on the iceberg itself. And through this combination of chelicerate meat and plants, Marguerite was able to get proper nutrition, alongside enough of whatever's in the fevered peppers and frost vases to survive the Kara for the next 10 years. Eventually, way back on the crater, the baby sea emperors were finally hatched, allowing a much more stable and concentrated form of enzyme 42 to be released. This eventually spread to Sector 0, permanently curing Marguerite and everything else. Now, as happy as I am with this theory, it is by no means bulletproof. There's a reason I titled this video Attempting to Explain Subnautica's Biggest Plot Hole, and that's because there's still a couple of inconsistencies I wasn't able to work out. First up is the fevered peppers and frost vases. If they were what was keeping Sector Zero alive, I have no idea how the antidote was able to get from them into the main food chain. The only land creatures that would even eat them would be sky rays and maybe the occasional snow stalker, since despite what the wiki says, they appear to be at least somewhat omnivorous. But snow stalkers are only ever eaten by ice worms, and sky rays don't appear to have any predators, so it's unclear how they would have actually passed the antidote along. Also, the frozen leviathan being infected kinda throws a wrench in the whole idea that leviathans are more resistant to the Kara, so yeah, I don't really know what's going on with that. In a similar vein, you have something like the crab snake, which, while not a leviathan, still appears to be at the top of its respective food chain, and yet it's still able to get infected just like any other creature. And the last detail's a lot smaller, but you can find these cured fish in Marguerite's base, which probably means she was eating more than just the chelicerates. But whether she's been doing this from the start or not is unknown. Still, this is my best guess for how she survived, but if you've got your own theory or think I might have missed something, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments. And while you're down there, if you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like or even subscribing. It helps out more than you might think. Anyways, that's all from me for now. I hope to see you all again very soon.